So I'm Domenico Montanaro, Senior Political Editor and Correspondent, and I want to introduce you to...
I'm Elena Moore. I'm a political researcher focusing on the 2020 campaign.
And we were able to take her out of her cave to where she's been working on our briefing books. Yeah. There are now many, many pages.
This is the first time I've seen sunlight in like 2 months.
This isn't really sunlight though, but this is the closest she's come. So we have Super Tuesday.
Yes.
Why is it a big day?
Looking at the amount of delegates at stake on Super Tuesdays, there's 1,357 delegates. And to put that in perspective, on our first day of the election, during the Iowa caucus, there were only 41 delegates at stake. But on Super Tuesday, that's 30% of the entire delegates possible to obtain in the entire primary season.
Yeah, I mean, so far we've only had 4% of the delegates allocated. We've had 4 states go so far. We're going to have 14 states from Virginia to California, from Minnesota to Texas. This is a very diverse set of states. Half of the states have significant African-American populations in the Democratic electorate. A few very key states have Latino populations that could be a big factor. In particular, I'm thinking about the crown jewel on Super Tuesday, right?
Yes. California has the most delegates at stake on Super Tuesday. There are 415, which is the most by far. Texas has 228. So even compared to Texas, which is also a huge, huge state for the candidates, there's nothing in comparison. You
know, we're seeing this surge from Joe Biden. Endorsements the day after South Carolina and into Monday. Is that enough for him? Because he has not been doing so well on advertising. Right. Bernie Sanders is the favorite going in. What are their numbers looking like for who's on air?
Who's on air? I mean, when you're looking at Super Tuesday alone, the real person that stands out is actually someone we haven't talked about yet, which is former New York City Mayor Mike Bloomberg. Mike Bloomberg hasn't been on the ballot in any of the first 4 states, even though he announced in late November he wasn't on the ballot in any of them. But Mike Bloomberg has spent $250 million on advertising. I don't think that really makes sense unless you hear it multiple times, but that is around $200 million on one day. In comparison, Joe Biden has spent under $1 million, according to data we got last week.
Well, you know, the one advantage that Joe Biden has is that he has the highest name recognition of any of the candidates. Sanders, though, has spent $15.5 million on those Super Tuesday states, and that is who the principal contender is compared to Biden. The real issue here, when we talked about California, how many delegates are at stake, it is so important, if you're a Joe Biden fan, that he does at least okay in California, because he could wind up losing, being very far behind, losing a net of 100, 200 delegates. And if that were to happen, there's no way that he could catch up.
Right, but it's important to note, I think, still that even though Super Tuesday has so many delegates, you still cannot completely clean up and have a majority to go to the nomination. You can have a clear front-runner status.
And tell us why the number 15 is so important.
Putting the Republican primary contests aside, Democratic contests have a 15% threshold if you want to obtain any delegates on the district level or in the statewide level. So in order to get a 15%, the candidate has to get proportionally 15% of that total vote. So when you look back on New Hampshire, Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren didn't do as well there, and they both got, I think, under 15% and didn't get any delegates in the state.
Right. So you get 0 delegates if you're under that 15% threshold. And the reason that's so important is if you look at a state like California, recent polling has shown Bernie Sanders with a very big lead and a lot of candidates sort of teetering on that 15% threshold line. And if, you know, for some reason or some way Bernie Sanders winds up with, let's say, 35% of the vote, and nobody else gets above 15%, he gets all 415 delegates. That would be a lead that nobody could possibly be able to catch up to him with unless something catastrophic happened. Meanwhile, in the other states, Joe Biden is hoping to split a lot of the delegates, if not do better than Bernie Sanders in places like Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama,
Tennessee.
But 60% of the delegates still to be allocated after Super Tuesday. We're going to know 90% of the delegates and how they've been allocated by the end of April. So we're talking about a month and a half, 2 months, where we will have a very, very good idea of who the nominee is by the end of April.
Yeah, the current delegate count, it'll seem really low, but it does show that Bernie Sanders is in the front. He has 60 delegates, followed by Joe Biden after a really, really strong win in South Carolina.
And you need 1,991 delegates for a pledge majority to become the nominee. So we have a long way to go.
Yeah.
Well, I'm Domenico Montanaro, Senior Political Editor at NPR.
And I'm Elena Moore. I am a political researcher at NPR.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks.
So how many are in Texas?
228.
How many are in Alabama?
I don't know, Alabama.
Not Arkansas? She just said before she was rattling off
I'm
all these numbers.
the top ones. California, 415. Texas, 228. North Carolina, 110. Virginia, 99. Massachusetts, 91.